And it's fascinating that we had such a broad and fascinating survey by scholars who are really so remarkably uh, versed not only in their disciplines, but posing larger dilemmas. So from Tim, we got a sense of that larger mosaic of life. From Bala, the importance of materials flows. And Radhika, of course, brought us face to face with the dilemmas and challenges of technology and economic transformation. And I think in the last session, all three panelists gave us a very clear sense of how the questions of communication are also about location, about where those of us who are in the world of the so-called intelligentsia, how do we seek a place which is both relevant and apt to the larger citizenry, and that requires us rethinking what we do and how we do it. I was really struck by the fact you picked a historian to speak at the end. Most historians are apt when asked a question to say two things. One, that the answer is long. It is, but we don't have time, do we? And that it's complicated. I'm sure it is, but again, we don't have time, do we? And since I don't have the answers in any case, I thought it might help to tease out two, three things which seem to stand out. One, that one of the great insights of the sciences over the last 100 odd years has been about the way the soils, the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, the mosaic of life are interconnected. And that sense of being in a unified planet has never been greater than by the end of the 20th century. At the same time, the will of some humans to dominate other humans, uh, and in order to do so, to forge new means of technology, crudely defined here as means to master or to conquer or dominate nature and other humans, has led to enormous transformations. Many of these technologies have been put at the service of states or at the service of very large economic interests. And one is struck whenever one hears the term the Anthropocene, the idea that humans as a collective have perhaps acquired huge power to transform the life support systems on Earth, that much of this power rests not in the hands of all humans or most humans, but very few humans. And this perhaps lies at the heart of some of the dilemmas when we confront climate change. Linked to these two, the fact that there is a unified planet, but it's divided into nation states, within which there are enormous disparities, not just of wealth or of power, or for that matter, of opportunity. Gender would be a very clear marker of the absence or lack of equal opportunity. But one could say by the sharp divide between those who are unable to live a life of human dignity and material dignity, and others who have access, perhaps on a larger scale than ever before, to levels of affluence, which were impossible for all but a very tiny section, even 150 or 200 years ago. Looking at it in this way, one can tend to be somewhat gloomy. So I'd like to be counterfactual and refer to two, three instances of why I think the gloom perhaps should not be all pervasive. Needless to add, one of these is the fortunate instance that this conclave has been organized in the dying days of February 2021, because some of the events of November, December, January 2020, of 2020-21, the winter, have enormous implications. The President of the United States deputed for the first time as Special Envoy on Climate Change, who in an interview with CNN, I'm referring to John Kerry, compared the scale of the threat of climate change to that of the threat of nuclear war. And he further said that very few people in 1985 or 87 would have foreseen a downscaling of the threat of nuclear annihilation. At the time, the two major superpowers had 100,000 nuclear warheads. And beginning with the accords in 1987 between the leaders of the Soviet Union, now extinct, we still have Russia, and the United States, very much there in the ring, the number of those nuclear warheads has decreased by 86%. Much of the basis of this cooperation came because of the rapport of those particular leaders. But I think it is fair to say that right from the beginning, of the use of nuclear weapons in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, going back to the questions that were raised about the ethics and the implications of nuclear warfare by figures such as Einstein and Bertrand Russell, and the enormous movements of nuclear disarmament, of nuclear de-escalation, not only in the United States and Soviet Union, but in various other countries. One thinks of Europe, one refers to Gandhi in India, to Andrei Sakharov in the Soviet Union, and several others. So, despite the fact that states do push sometimes for highly destructive acts, and what could be more destructive than a universal nuclear conflagration, it is possible for them to step back from the brink. We are not away from the brink, but it's better than being over the brink. The other is a somewhat different instance, which is that in the last 40 odd years, one of the secular features of the modern world has been the economic transformation of China. This 40-year period from the late 70s to 2008 saw some 10% growth per year. But over the last 15 odd years, there has been a transformation where the Chinese leadership has gone further than it did ever before to argue in terms of what they call an ecological civilization, written first into the party program, then the state program, then the constitution. And in the tussle for being a major world power, which of course has not only military or ideological dimensions, but also has intellectual and moral claims of legitimacy, the Chinese leadership sees its commitment to going green, the expansion of renewables, the preservation of rare species, China setting itself as an example, the ban over the recent years on ivory imports, the agreement to not allow tiger skin trade from outside. Fascinating, the fact that in state banquets in China, you may eat lots of things, but shark fin soup is banned because of a huge campaign which included unlikely figures like Chinese pop stars. Now, there are limits again over here. In a very interesting recent book, Lei Fei Yi and Shapiro argue that China going green may actually be about the state drawing on green issues to strengthen itself. It may not be so much an authoritarian system saving the environment, but an authoritarian system doing some positive environmental things while leaving a lot untouched, because it's legitimacy that it is seeking. And what they say about China may apply to many societies and states and countries, that while it is true that China has enormously expanded renewables, the scale at which coal has grown in a 5-year recent period is some 5 to 6 times that of the renewables. But it's still significant that there is at least the acknowledgement of the need to address the ecological danger. And doubtless this is also because of an enormous transformation in Chinese society, not just a transformation due to literacy or travel, but because China has the world's largest middle class. An astonishing large number of Chinese have studied abroad and come back. A huge feature across China has been the popularity of bird watching, of nature trips, and of citizen groups who one hesitates to call activists because they have to be loyal, well, ultra loyal if they don't want to be picked up and vanish, who have lobbied consistently people at various levels, not just the state authorities at the federal level or the national level, but at the local level. I'd like to end, of course, with India. And I was very struck by what Radhika said about India, that it's a society of contradictions. The great Joan Robinson, Cambridge economist, once said that India is a society where contradictions and opposites abound. But it's very significant in a very recent set of interventions over the last few years, one as recently as last week. Indian Prime Minister and those before him have not only said they will expand renewables, but actually mentioned a figure like 40% by 2030. Of course, again, one has to be hesitant. Are all renewables clean? One may look at hydropower as an instance. It's involved in a lot of displacement, forest loss, species loss, with gains sometimes, which perhaps are outweighed by costs. But here is the dilemma in a very interesting and oft-quoted line, which I'm sure we are from different disciplines, but we're all familiar with this line. Alice asked the cat, which way does this road go? And the cat said, it all depends on where you want to go. One of the dilemmas in a country such as India is that unlike most of those other countries we named, Europe, US, even China, many of those who are consumers are also producers. Some 45–50% lives off the land. They grow crops, they herd animals, they fish, they do a range of agroecological based activity, which both makes them vulnerable to ecological shifts, but also makes their role complex. They are not only consumers and producers, and here India is like the US and Europe, they are voters. And being voters, and in a country where there's a multi-party democracy, free speech, judiciary, labor unions, right of associations, these are issues that figure in the popular realm in a very large way. And it seems to me that the issue of citizen science, therefore, is particularly important. Very struck over the last 10 years, not just by the growth of birding and bird watching, but the fact that citizen science with Birdwatch and Climate Watch has the largest number of people, no big surprise here, in the state of Kerala, which has the highest literacy, uh, probably the best gender ratios, and a long history of citizen activism in a range of fields. But it's also striking that in many parts of coastal India, citizen science has included measurements of the salinity at the places where rivers flow into the sea. So there's this enormous potential of people. And by the way, in Kerala, they're working in Malayalam. In my own native state of Tamil Nadu, in the last few years, there's been enormous work done in recovering or cataloging Tamil names for migrant as well as resident birds. And this huge transformation because of the mobile phone revolution is going along with a new awareness of nature. Where does that go? Does it just stop with recording birds? I don't know. But the other part of the producers is very crucial, just to remind ourselves these shifts in climate, the changes in the groundwater table, changes of temperature when the winter begins or ends. And we are speaking in an area, the University of Ashoka is located in a wheat growing region. This has enormous implications for livelihood and the search for material dignity. Equally so with the oceans. My colleague who will be speaking tomorrow, Divya Karnad, whenever she speaks to students, sometimes comes up with a slide, it's a very scary slide, where it says that 86% of the near coastal waters are overfished. So we feel like asking, what happens when it gets to 100%? Is there a place when you go off the cliff? And if it's at the bottom, what are the implications? What are the implications particularly for those who live on fisheries? So how does one relate the questions posed by sciences, the sciences of life, which emphasize that the life support systems of the planet depend or are intertwined with the living mosaic of life? How does one reconcile that with the fact that the search for material and human dignity has just become more complex? Because along with the issue of justice across gender, occupation, race, caste, class, all of that, one has to think of justice in terms of the future, justice in terms of the future generations, justice in terms of the younger generation, and justice beyond humanity, because we are looking at justice in terms of other species. And here, there's just one thing I'd tag, and I think it needs to be tagged. Everyone has said it implicitly. While we think of material dignity, there is some sense of material dignity all humans ought to be entitled to. Much of the UN's debates on sustainable development boils down to that. A child going hungry, a woman not being able to read and write, but even though she wants to, and so on and so forth. But in that debate, what is the issue? Where does the question of affluence fit in? Particularly with its enormous environmental footprints. I'm very conscious I'm speaking on a computer, coal-fired electric power, and so are many of you. And related to that, and I'll end here, is that this issue of material dignity, affluence, becomes even more significant in those societies where that material dignity is just becoming possible or has become possible within the last lifetime or in the coming lifetime. So this notion, and I like I'm just picking one thing, the notion of the crossroads is also one of the choice of what kind of justice do we think of when we think of justice beyond the present and beyond humanity? And when we think of material dignity, how do we look at dignity beyond humanity? Thank you. I'm sure that over the next today and tomorrow, we'll have fascinating dialogues, and all of us at Ashoka hope that we will continue in the real person, much as it's wonderful to meet everyone over Zoom. Thanks.